My name's Neal.
I'm Jason.
And we're here today to talk about the Living Annual Report. And just for context, I think everybody probably knows what an annual report is. In the nonprofit sector, of course, they produce them, they print them, send them out to funders like us. When it came our turn to do one, we thought, wow, we really need to try to mix this up and do it a bit differently. So the word living was added because the annual report was built in Tableau. It's on Tableau Public, and it's updated every week. So instead of being an annual report that gets updated once a year, it's actually updated once a week, and so we always have current information up there. So that's what it is. But before we dive in, let me just give you some context about Tableau Foundation. We were started in 2014, and we now have a team of 4 people. And you can see our mission up on the screen. And really, for those of you in the sector, you think of us as capacity builders. So our role is really to partner with nonprofit organizations. We make grants to them that often are a mix of software, training, and financial support. And then we engage the Tableau ecosystem, meaning our employees, our customers, and our partners in helping that nonprofit build its capacity to use data to achieve the objectives that they want to achieve. In the data village, you will see that we have 4 of our grantees there. Please stop by and talk to them. One of the things that I've noticed is that some of these nonprofit organizations that are using Tableau are doing as advanced, if not more advanced work in some cases than a lot of our commercial partners. And it's because of the conditions they're working in sometimes require really a lot of innovation to overcome some of the challenges in those conditions. You can see here just a broad brush of where we make grants, the sectors, and this framework is the Sustainable Development Goal framework out of the United Nations. So we aligned our grant making behind those. And you can see sort of the stack rank of where our funding and support has gone since 2014. And this is a page from our annual report that you will see in a minute. Oops. There we go. So we're going to do, oh, you're going to flip over. So we're going to do a quick run through. I'm going to give you like a 45-second overview of what the annual report looks like, just so you have it in your head as we're going through the presentation. And then we're going to talk about, we'll walk through it and we'll do a deeper dive a little bit later. So this is the annual report live on Tableau Public. You can see that we have the cover page with this very handsome gentleman on the front.
He's very humble as well.
Yes, of course. And this just gives you an overview of our grant making. And then the next slide, the next worksheet is look at our work year by year. So it's an annual report. We figured we needed to give people an ability to see what our grant making each year. And then our global reach. So I spend a lot of time at the United Nations talking with congressional staff and people in different states, and so it's really important for me to be able to click and show what we're doing in a particular country. We have a really robust employee giving campaign, and so we're showing here the issues that our employees support, because we're really an employee-led foundation, and we want to make sure that their passions and interests are reflected in the annual report. Then we have featured grants, and this is really where we show a specific grantee, when the grant was made, what the value was, and why we made the grant. And this goes all the way back, of course, through the beginning of time. We make grants in cities where we have offices, so we have employee teams that get together and disperse money and make grants to nonprofits. And so this allows our employees, as well as nonprofits in cities where we have offices, to see and get an understanding of what kind of grant making we do in those offices. We have the SDG slide, so when I'm at the United Nations, this really helps me sort of frame my discussion with them in a framework that they understand. And then we have the partner page. So Tableau's ecosystem is very broad. We're super excited that these partners have actually engaged with the foundation, providing support and product on some of our most important initiatives. Like magic, you do it. It's great. This is the agenda. So we're going to talk about why we developed the Living Annual Report. We're going to talk about how we built it in Tableau. And then we're going to actually talk about change management. How do we actually get people within Tableau and outside of Tableau through the process of accepting this new form of annual report? And we wouldn't actually be here today if it wasn't for this gentleman to my left. Jason Suchumacher's on my team. He was the first person I hired. As you will find out during today's session, I'm the big idea guy, and he is the detail process guy. And I've learned throughout my career that it's super important for me to be successful to have somebody on my team who has Jason's skills. And Jason is really the brainchild of this annual report. He built it, and a little later he'll take us some deep dives and talk technically about what he did. But he had some, as I got to earlier, my sort of use of this annual report is storytelling to funders and political people. Jason had different pain points, so why don't you talk about those?
Sure. So the main pain point that I had when we started talking about building a living annual report a couple of years ago, my main pain point was Neal. I'm
a terrible human being.
He came to me on semi-regular basis, but kind of inconsistently, and ended up asking me for essentially a bunch of summary statistics about what we were doing within Tableau Foundation and our grant making. And ultimately, this was super hard to pull together. This type of summary statistic that we end up having up here, what our employee engagement looks like, what our top grant recipients were, this was a 6-hour process to end up getting to. And the reason for that is probably something that all of you can understand and sympathize with. This was basically what our data workflow looked like. And so whenever Neal ended up getting this request from his management, and then things rolled downhill to me to end up producing just basic visualizations, what I had to do is I had to go through this long kind of arcane workflow that did a bunch of data integration, deduping, ultimately just to get a couple of summary level statistics for our management team.
And so one thing that you should take away from this, what I hear from all of you all the time that I talk to is, I don't know, our data is so messy. People think Tableau has it all together. We don't. So we started with very messy data.
And ultimately, this is kind of how we started thinking about what we could end up doing with our data. Around this time, Neal had also been asking me, in addition to kind of these ad hoc requests for odd summary statistics, he'd been asking me, hey, what are you going to start doing in terms of putting together an annual report? And I really wasn't thinking about wanting to do that at this time. When I thought of an annual report, I thought of something like this, just a bunch of papers on a desk. I've been using a computer since I was 8, and actually producing a physical annual report that would stay on my desk and would be 6 months out of date by the time we actually produced it just horrified me. And so I wanted to make sure that we had a better system in place to be able to pull together something more readily and kind of more easily for me. So ultimately, this whole process of pulling together the living annual report was so that I wouldn't ever have to build another annual report again. And it was also a way for me to be able to justify building an integration workflow for our data so that we could end up doing these internal analytics that people were asking for, and being able to build this external facing piece just ended up being something that was really easy to do alongside of it as well.
Yeah, and he also watched as our grantees would send us printed annual reports. And I'd flip open like 2 pages, put it on my desk, and then a week later it would go in the recycle bin. And sorry, we have some grantees in the room, so hopefully you weren't the ones that sent us the annual reports. But he saw this kind of cycle where there's like all this effort that goes into it. And if you've done them before, they are hard work, and you really try to polish your message and so on. And he just saw the fact that we would get it, we wouldn't really read it, and it would go in the recycle bin. So
So ultimately, we decided not to end up doing that paper annual report. And one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to use Tableau for this purpose as kind of a dual prong thing. One, we knew it, we had it, we're comfortable with it. But the second part is we wanted to provide a model for other people who wanted to do this type of thing as well. And when we ended up going out and trying to find, were other people doing this type of thing? Were other people building this annual report and kind of keeping it live? We found maybe one example, but it was kind of in this for-profit realm, and no one had seemed to do this with the nonprofit or foundation annual report. So we saw an opportunity there.
And one thing just I want to point out, so this, this is our annual report, but it doesn't have to be, you can do this for nearly any report that you're working on. So it's an annual report to us, but this could be a departmental report, a board report, whatever. So to kind of keep that in mind as we go through this for what your specific use case might be.
Yeah. So I'll give you a quick rundown of kind of how it's built in Tableau, what the nuts and bolts look like. Ultimately, one thing that I want to make sure that everyone here takes away, two key points, is that you can start on this. I mean, everyone in this room can do what we've done here. And then the second bit is you don't need to wait until your data is perfect. And in fact, I mean, you've heard this in keynotes, you've heard this throughout the conference, your data will never be perfect. And so just pull off the Band-Aid, just give it a start. I promise you that you can do exactly what we've done here.
And as Jason kind of flips into this, the other thing we want you to really think about today and learn from our process is the value of iteration. So we didn't spend months and months and months planning and kind of do this big launch. We sort of iterated, and we're continually iterating on this as we learn about how it could be useful both for us and for others outside of Tableau.
Yeah. So this up here is one example. This is one of the 8 dashboards that makes up our current living annual report. I'm going to break down the areas in this for you. So this is a normal dashboard, and within it we have header image and header text. So this is just a dashboard image and some text on a dashboard. We have, this thing's really twitchy, so I think it's doing like 2 at a time. But we have 2 worksheets here. We've got a map and a bar chart. Just 2 simple visualizations that we've built. I like to use floating filters on all of our annual report pieces. I think it lends a really clean design element to it. But these are just filters that we have on here. And then 5 is that text object up above, literally just a dashboard text object. It could be something that's a dynamic worksheet that shows text that flips, or could just be static. And then we have that footer and the footer logo. And so when it comes to all of the pieces of the living annual report, this is kind of the consistent part. We have this header, we have this footer, and then we have content inside of it. And so you've all done this. You may not have built headers and footers before in Tableau Desktop, but ultimately this isn't a departure from anything that you have done here.
And a word of warning, if you're like me and you're the big idea guy and you're not as technical, this may go over your head a bit, but that's okay. We're going to come back to some other stuff that's for you. If you are technical, this is the part of the presentation where we're going to do some deep dives in a few tricky things in Tableau, and hopefully you'll walk away with some ideas for what you can do back in your office.
So this visualization up here, this was an important one, as Neal mentioned, that I made sure that he had access to. And it really serves 2 purposes. It serves the purpose of showing grants throughout the world, but it also serves the purpose of showing grants within the US. And so we have this filter here that will end up showing a map for the US or a map for the world. And the reason why it was important to do this is we are ultimately a US-based organization, but we do a lot of work outside of the US. But I needed to be able to provide Neal with the resources to be able to say, I'm talking with a congressional leader in Washington State. And so I want to be able to talk about the work that we're doing in Washington State. And I want to be able to filter down to the organizations that we're supporting there. So one of the things that's tricky about this is we're using 2 levels of detail. We have country, so we have the entire world reviewing our grant making by country, and then we're using this worksheet here to look at our grant making by state. And for some of you, you've probably run into this in Tableau. Tableau can't show 2 levels of detail like that by default. And so I put together a trick that I ended up learning from some of the information lab blogs online to end up showing these 2 levels of detail in the same sheet. And so what I've done is here it looks like we only have 2 worksheets on this view. We have the bar chart, we have the map. What's actually happening beneath the surface is we have 4 worksheets, 2 maps, 2 bar charts. And what I'm doing is I'm using a parameter as a filter for each one of these maps. And so the filter or the parameter is pretty simple. You've seen it already. It's this United States and entire world filter. And so what this is controlling it's controlling for this filter here, and it's checked to only US. And so when we end up switching this parameter and we go to entire world, we're no longer on US, and so this ends up disappearing because the selection on the filter isn't valid. And so when that happens, everything hides. And what I've done on this dashboard is I've encased everything within a dashboard object here, a container. And when you end up using containers on a dashboard, and what the action that your worksheet is going to try to do is it's going to try to take up all of that space within that container. And so if you filter an entire worksheet out and there's no data to display, what's going to happen is that object is going to collapse down to kind of 1 pixel in size. And so we're able to effectively hide worksheets through this filtering by parameter method. So on this worksheet, this is a pretty simple visualization. This is a pretty simple dashboard that I think ends up being pretty effective. We've gotten a lot of good feedback from people in terms of what they're able to do with this. And the idea that we had with this dashboard in particular was to be able to show people what does our grant making look like and just expose all of these mission grants for people to be able to understand. What we want to do is we want to be able to tell stories about our grantees. And so what we can end up doing is we can end up filtering for any of these bubbles up here. So these bubbles are selectors, and then there's also this filter up here that you can end up using if you know the organization that you want to look for. But one of the things that we've done here is we've just cleaned up the tooltips. This is a super simple thing, but it's super important when it comes to producing a visualization that you want to publish out on your website, that you want really to represent your brand and your activities. And so what we've done here is we've modified the tooltips to be just a little bit more elegant, and then we've also created this dynamic text down below. And the way that we've done this is pretty simple. All we've done is we've ended up doing a little formatting within the text mark here. Ooh, there we go. And so within here, this is some of the kind of basic Tableau behavior. When you drop something onto the text shelf there, what you end up getting is Tableau will automatically create this month of donation date or sum of grant value and things like that. All we've done is we've just cleaned this up a little bit. And functionally, what this lets you do is on the dashboard, when you're filtering down to one object, it allows you to create kind of this custom menu and this text that will filter for any grantee that you're working with. One of the things that was important for us when it came to our community grant making was kind of going down to that super micro level. Because this community grant-making program ends up being hyper-local, so we're in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle, and our grant-making encompasses the Fremont and Wallingford neighborhoods. So a very, very small area within the greater Seattle community. We wanted to be able to make sure that our grantees knew this and that prospective grantees who wanted to apply for grants when we open our grant cycle each year were aware of kind of what we really fund, so that they wouldn't spend time applying for something that was really outside the scope of what we would end up being able to do. And so what we ended up doing is we really made effort to make sure that we had the full latitude and longitude for our grantees mapped out here. But the challenge with that is that wasn't something that we were integrating into our database. It wasn't something that we were collecting. And so we had to do a little bit of work to end up getting that off of the address. And so one of the ways that we ended up going about this, there are a lot of tools online that will end up just literally converting an address field to a latitude and longitude. And then what I ended up doing, so I did that in bulk, and then what I did is I took that export, which was just essentially a table that was provided to me, and I pasted it into Tableau as a data source. And once I had that, I went ahead and I used that new data source, that pasted data source, and I blended on organization name. And so the point here is that I didn't have to end up doing kind of a full data integration to bring this into my database. Because I knew that I was only going to be using these latitude and longitude fields for one purpose, all I did is I just pasted them into Tableau and I blended it. So super easy way to end up saving a lot of time on something that's relative limited set of data. And then the last thing that I want to show here is, again, kind of a simple tip and trick. On our partners page, we really, when Neal said that we can't do the work that we do without them, he's being entirely sincere. The work that our partners do is fundamental to the support that we can provide to our grantees, and we want to make sure that they get as much credit as possible. And one of the small ways that we can do this with this acknowledgement page is just linking out to them. So each one of these is a dashboard object. So this is a dashboard image that ends up having a URL associated with it. And so that links out to the Alteryx for Good page. And one of the really creative ways that I've seen people using this type of object is I've seen a couple of organizations build a parameter on a worksheet for prospective donors. And on this, what they do is they say, if you donate X amount, X could be $100 or something like that, here's how the money flows through our organization. And then what they do is they use that parameter value that the person just entered and wrap it into a URL action so that it links out to a donation page and populates that value. And so in terms of the interactivity, that's amazing. The potential of being able to keep that connection with a prospective donor is incredible. But when it comes to actually building this in Tableau, it's a super simple thing. All of these dashboards, again, we've got the same layout. We have the header, we've got the footer, and we have a bit of content in here. The way that I ended up going about building this in an easy way is when we started on this project, I went ahead and I built kind of a master dashboard. And on this master dashboard, I used a placeholder image, I used placeholder text, and I used a placeholder footer. And then all I did is I duplicated that dashboard to keep that consistent layout so that you don't have to kind of do that pixel perfect adjustment to where your image is at or where this footer image ends up lying. So you really just have that consistent template that you can just put content into and adjust if you need to. I'm going to turn things back over to Neal. And I think that this is the hardest part that Neal is going to talk about. How do you get people to actually accept change? When we ended up putting our data out there in the first place, and being transparent with our grant making, that was a pretty radical idea for some people. And so we have some things that we can share with you in how we ended up doing that, and I think how you can probably take that back to your organizations as well.
And a few things we were trying to do. So we talked about how the purpose of this for me was when I'm talking to my leadership team, or when I'm in the halls of Congress meeting with congressional staffers, or at the UN, or at some country meeting, and somebody asks me something specific about what we're doing about something they care about, this gives me a way to answer that question quickly and succinctly and accurately. The other thing it does for us is we're really interested in helping advance the concept of transparency for foundations. And so when we put this together, we really wanted to push the boundaries of transparency in our grant making as a way to sort of join others who have been pushing that boundary and advance that topic within the sector. So when we think about getting people used to transparency, the one thing we really learned from our process is there's two ways to start when you think about transparency. One is you start way back here with the minimal amount of information that you know you can share, and then you sort of incrementally add transparency. Or the thing that we did that we think actually worked better is when we were cycling this through cycles inside our organization, we started with maximum transparency. So we shared everything, and then we worked with our internal stakeholders to then walk back the things that they felt were too transparent for various reasons. And there's a couple of transparency issues that we ran into. There is truly sensitive data. So one of the reasons that you can't download our workbook off Tableau Public is because we have row-level employee giving data. So we have data that says John Smith donated $500 to the local food bank. And that's too much personal information for us to be sharing about our employees. And so that's what led to that heat map that we showed earlier that shows kind of the areas that are the topics that our employees care about, but not the individual giving. So that was a pretty easy, that's just data we can't share. But then there's this issue of perceived sort of transparency and the perceived issues. And that really came up when we were looking at our grant making, our featured grant page. And as I said earlier, our grants are a combination of product, training, and financial support. And in the spirit of starting with maximum transparency, Jason and I actually put the exact dollar values of each of those components on the Living Annual Report. And as we ran that up through our legal team and through other stakeholders, they felt like that was sharing a bit too much information for various reasons. And so what we ended up doing was walking another step back. And so when you look at that page in our annual report now, you actually see that we just show the aggregate total value of the grant that we made to that organization. And frankly, that even sharing that number was a little bit scary for people. One of the issues that you think about when you're a foundation is, you might give, you'll see up here that we gave in aggregate about a $2 million grant to Feeding America, who are here presenting in Data Village. And then we also gave the World Food Program, which is a global program working to end hunger. And they're very different sized grants. So one thing that we had to think about is what's when we put that out there, how is World Food Program going to feel when they see that Feeding America got a grant 2 or 3 times the size of what they got? And what kind of conversations does that drive? So we really had to dive into those deeply.
And I mean, on the process end of that, the way that we really got to kind of a happy medium there, after starting with kind of that maximum transparency, is we ran through a very iterative design process. So throughout our entire process here, we didn't have a set really endpoint that we were aiming to get to. Instead, what we were doing is we were running many iterations and running many iterations by stakeholders. And so when it came to having reviews with nonprofits, we ended up sending them the workbook, we send them a link, and they end up giving us feedback. We tweak some things, send it back, or send it to other people, get that feedback, continue tweaking. When it came to these legal and regulatory issues, it was really helpful to be able to actually be in the room with the people who had the concern and be able to say, okay, so you're concerned about displaying this data this way. All right, let's drag. How about this way? And so doing that iterative design ended up letting us kind of get at more at what the real cause for concern was, as opposed to what they thought their concern was.
Yeah. And then we also, the last point here about, is it your data to share? So we actually talked with our grantees, showed them what data we were going to share about the grants, and made sure that our sharing of that data didn't mess anything up for them. So it was a pretty iterative process, and we're really pleased with where we ended up. So the other thing that you've probably seen a few times, but the other thing that we've noticed, not only in building the annual report, but working with a lot of our grantees, is that when you're trying to move people along, from this traditional format they're used to, and it might be a PDF, it might be a printed annual report, it might be, printed Excel spreadsheets, that there's this human transition process that you have to take people through, and some people are pretty resistant to change, as I'm sure all of you know. So I'm going to tell a story about a grantee and the process we went through. This is World Food Program, and they basically measure food security conditions in the 80 countries where they work, and then they produce reports that go to program directors in those countries, and the program directors use those food security reports to make decisions on how to intervene, whether they send in vouchers, whether they send in food, and sort of the most appropriate thing. They moved from this concept of sending people in to take surveys and then come back and type the data in and blah, 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 and it would take like 90 days, to collecting data on mobile devices. And so now this process that used to take 90 days now takes 3 or 4 days, and so the program directors get faster information to make better decisions about what's going on in a particular region. So they use this model where those program directors are humanitarians, not necessarily digitally enthusiastic. And so they were used to getting these PDFs. And so what Feeding America decided to do was use story points in Tableau and model the story flow to match exactly what the PDF was. So when somebody who was used to reading the PDF saw this, they weren't completely disoriented by what they saw. It actually looked and felt a bit familiar. And just like in our Living Annual Report, that picture of the handsome guy on the front page, that front page is a typical front page you see in a nonprofit annual report. And so we followed that same model.
And one thing about this, how many of you people can I get a show of hands about how many people cringe when they see the pie chart here?
Are there pie chart haters in the audience?
Be honest, this is a safe space. I think it's not bad to have this pie chart here. And the reason being is that in this change management process, the most important thing when it comes to kind of offering up a new type of report in a new format is actually getting people to use it. And I've talked with some of you today about how you provide Tableau workbooks to people, or you provide visualizations on Tableau server, and people download the underlying data and then dump it into Excel. And so one of the important things here is moving the culture along slowly and kind of keeping pace with what people are going to be comfortable doing. And if that's putting a pie chart and keeping that in there until they develop comfort with this type of format, so be it. Then start building in more advanced visualizations and kind of ease them. You can't shock the system and provide them with the most efficient visualizations that you might want to produce, because ultimately it's about getting information to them.
Yeah, so there's people out there who've been seeing a pie chart to represent these data for a decade, and they're not necessarily going to want to instantly change to some other chart type, but they can over time. The other thing we want to talk about real quick is how do you get people excited about the work you're doing? How many of you have actually produced a kick-ass workbook, showed it to somebody, and you're so excited, and they're kind of like, eh. And you're like, damn, that was a great workbook. So we hear that all the time. It happens all the time. You're not alone. The thing that I have learned, and I have to talk about this all over the world, the thing that I've actually learned is that the worst possible thing you can do is a feature function demo of Tableau when you show your workbook.
So basically what I just did?
Basically what you just did. It's the worst possible thing you could do. The better thing to do is talk about the decisions that the dashboard can help them make. and put it in a framework that they actually understand. So here's another page from the World Food Program. In this case, they're using mobile phones to measure food security in the Boko Haram territories of Nigeria. Those are dangerous territories where they cannot send people. So they're getting the data via mobile devices. So when they present this to the program director who's responsible for Nigeria, they sit down with her and they talk about what the charts are saying, not here, click this filter and see that everything changes, it's cool, and click this bar and then this pops up. And it's not a feature function demo. The thing that you really have to help people understand is how can they look at this chart and make a better decision that helps, in our case, that helps them have more impact. And that's what really lands the point home. And it was interesting, I was showing some work we're doing on malaria to a chief of staff for a senator. And I was telling the story I was talking about the story the data was telling. And when he heard me say it, he basically stopped me midstream and he said, do you think we could do this for the opioid epidemic in the US? So he could see and hear in my description of the work that this technique that's being used to fight an infectious disease in Africa could actually apply to an infectious health systems problem in the US. So that's really super important, I think, that you really you help them see the value in the viz, and the value is not in how cool Tableau is. The value is in the story that the data tell them.
And that's hard for us to say, right? I mean, I just want to show people vizzes and like talk through them and show you how to do it, but it's hard.
So we're going to wrap up now and have some time for questions. The thing I'm just going to say, there's a bunch of changes we want to make, but one that's actually really important. And that is that we have these grants that we make to organizations, one of them called PATH, which is a global health NGO. They're here in the exhibit hall as well. Sometimes we'll make a grant to one NGO, and then that grant will support work in multiple countries. So with PATH, we support them, and then now they're working in about 7 countries where Tableau is being used. And we don't have that represented in the data. So when I click on the PATH grant, it looks like the grant was made to Seattle. And so now we have to do a whole nother data exercise to go sort of disaggregate that and find a way to show that when you click on PATH, you see that the work is actually happening in multiple countries and not just in Seattle. And so that's another project that Jason will be working on quite soon.
And I mean, one other thing that we have found is, I mean, as we end up kind of increasing the scope of programs that we work on, we've seen people collaborate. And this is an awesome thing. We've granted to one organization, and then they've collaborated with another organization on the same project, and there's this awesome kind of building of projects that happens. And we don't have a way of supporting that in our data either. And so I need to go back and kind of integrate that into our workflow.
So you can see the key takeaways today. You can do this. You don't need to be perfect. All of our data actually right now is still in Excel, believe it or not. People, again, think Tableau is like this super cool, hot company and everything's in a cool database. It's not. It's all in Excel. We'll move it to SQL at some point when it makes sense. And then just be iterative. Engage your stakeholders early and often and help them see the story that the data is actually telling them.
And one thing that I also want to mention is that we did all of this with one copy of Tableau Desktop and Tableau Public. This is something that any of you can do in this room. Doesn't require that you have Tableau Server set up. It doesn't require that you have a bunch of copies of Tableau Desktop. We did this with Tableau Public and Tableau Desktop, partially as a way of showing that this can be a super lightweight solution. And once you've built this, everything's going to auto-update. I refresh our extracts once a week. I tend to do them on Monday. And that refresh takes about 5 minutes to refresh and to republish up to Tableau Public. And so the amount of time there is nothing compared to what it would take to create a new annual report each year. And so for me, as kind of the operations person here, this has saved me so much time, and it's allowed me to end up providing a tool out to other people so that they can answer their own questions, and Neal doesn't come to me and say, hey, would you like to spend 6 hours of your day doing something that you don't really want to do?
No promises. So we need to wrap up here, so we want to give you guys some time for questions. So anybody have a question you want to shout out?
And
Yes.
can I also make a request? As you end up asking your question. Tell us one thing that you want to take away and take back to your organization from this.
Good. Oh, now you put him on the spot.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good question.
See, there we go.
My question, I may have to touch it. My question was, I guess my challenge, and I don't know if you guys have a similar challenge, but I'd like to do something like this, but we have so many processes that only happen on a monthly or quarterly or annual basis. Do you guys have stuff like that that you have to account for? And so, are you using like projections or something like that to account for that, or is that just not an issue that you have right now?
It's not an issue for us. We don't have, I mean, in terms of us putting out all of this data, I mean, all of this is entirely voluntary on our part. We don't have specific kind of reporting cycles or anything like that that we have to match to. But we are also pretty fortunate in that the data sources that we have access to update either every day or every week based off of their activity. And so that's kind of how we've chosen the refresh schedule of doing it every week. But ultimately, at some point, we're going to stage this up on Tableau Server and doing a little bit more automation from kind of kludgy data sources so that we can pull that down directly into a CSV and then run a data integration project and keep the data truly live.
And what you'll see is our grant making is sporadic, so we don't have a grant cycle that we do necessarily. So you'll see, you know, the line will go like this, and then all of a sudden we'll make 4 grants, and then it kind of goes. So when you look at the line charts, you actually see this kind of jagged nature, and it's just because we make grants when we're ready to make grants. And exactly. Yeah. They're not looking for us to be sort of have a consistent flow of grants over time. It's just we make them when they're right and ready to make. Yeah. Anyone else? Go ahead, and then you next.
This has to do with adoption, so that's what I want to take away. So we have a lot of people in our company that live and die by Excel.
Mm-hmm.
There's this guy named Steve, and he's the bane of my existence. I create something interactive and flexible, and at the end of the day, he just asks me to put it into Excel. So where have you had to stand your ground in pushing the adoption of your annual report, and how do you work with your stakeholders? I know you said you should ease into it, but after a year, I just don't want to support his Excel habit.
There's one thing I've seen, and the approach that we were talking earlier, that you're putting a crosstab in the Tableau workbook, so at least there's a familiar face, familiar data face for him. One thing I've seen, we haven't done this ourselves, but one thing I've seen is you set a deadline. And you basically say, I'm going to do this for you, but we need to move beyond this. And so let's figure out how we can get you by December 31st to move into this new format. And then it depends on how much authority you have and where this person is hierarchically. But you know what I mean? Like agree with him to set a time to transition off that. And then talk about how it's a burden for you from your workload to keep producing sort of these dueling reports, and that in an effort to streamline the work, it needs to be, you need to move beyond these crosstabs.
Well, I mean, and then my perspective is that, I mean, from what you've told me, I don't know why Steve wants things in Excel. So my first step would be to say, hey, Steve, why do you want these things in Excel? To get a little bit deeper, is it that he doesn't trust the visualizations? Is it that he needs to integrate other data sources? Is it that he just needs to do something else? Like, what's his motivation for wanting it in Excel? And then seeing whether you can solve that in what you're putting together. And eventually, one of the things that you may get to is sitting down with Steve and saying, okay, so this is your process that you do in Excel. I have replicated this in Tableau. I'm going to show you kind of the guts of it. I'll show you the underlying data. I'll show you how this was done. Can we agree that this is the same? And if Steve can say yes, then I think that you're further on the way of weaning him off of his dangerous habit.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, but we're going to be happy to stay around and answer more. Would you like to ask yours?
My question was around the additional data, the story you're trying to tell. Are you keeping that at the grantee level or at the program level within that team you have multiple?
That is a brilliant question. So that's the thing we're not doing well right now, is right now it's at the grantee level. So we give money to Path and support to Path to do XYZ. We also have projects where we actually have multiple grantees all working on a common program or issue. And so another data project for Jason is to figure out how do we represent that so that if I'm concerned about ending hunger or homelessness, there's some of our homelessness beneficiary grantees here. If I'm interested in that, like who are all the organizations that are engaged in that particular program? And so we have to actually switch up our data and do another iteration of this to show that. Yeah.
And on the data source end of things, I mean, at the row level, we end up having one grantee per row, one organization per row, and then we have a table that ends up providing the project description that will then join to whatever other tables we want to use for that.
Yeah.
Great recommendation about not waiting for the
Yes. Yeah, we say that a lot.
So it looks like it's 11 o'clock. I think, does the session go till 11:15 or 11? 11:15?
Well, then we could take questions for
Let's go for
hours.
questions.
Yeah.
So this report that you showed was like annual reports, but in my world, we kind of provide monthly and quarterly reports, but those reports sometimes have more of an action plan, stats, more narratives of what's happening. Like, do you have an example or just best tips for one data integration piece because you're accumulating narratives from people, I assume, and also like visualizing so much text as well?
So one of the things that we do here, so this is kind of a year-by-year filter, but I mean, the concept could be quarterly or monthly. But what we end up having here is the option to filter our grant making to a specific year or to look at overall time. And so this basically serves the function to filter this year-by-year page to a true annual report. And so one of the things that we've done for this is we've built a text field here that ends up playing off of this parameter and shows the 2014 text, 2015 text, and that's just a calculated field within Tableau Desktop to show that. You could incorporate that into your database if you wanted to, but for me, it's easier to just throw that as a calculation into Tableau. In terms of the data integration side of things, one of the great things about Tableau is if you're connected up to a database that ends up having your data from 2015 to present and goes down to kind of the day level, your filters can be whatever you want. And so, offering people the ability to filter down to a specific week or a specific month or something like that, that's not a technical challenge. And ultimately what you have to do is just make sure that you're updating the narrative text that's associated with it.
And one thing we work on a lot is simplifying and reducing text. Jason we have our V1 of this report was sort of portrait and had tons and tons of text on it. And what we realized is people just have no attention span anymore for reading. So we worked really hard to cut the text back and then use this sort of filter mechanism so that if I only need to look at Q1 and I need certain text around Q1 to give me the context, then I can get that with this filter, but without having to produce a new report every single time. The other thing we worked on with World Food Program is we had all their data scientists in a rapid prototyping session in The Hague. And what was interesting is the data scientists who were using R and doing all kinds of really deep statistical analysis, they wanted to put all of the statistical terms and methodologies on the viz. And it took us 3 days of hammering them to get them to the point where they actually pulled those, kind of the methodology and other statistical information off the main viz and put it on a different story point. Because we kept saying, like, who's your audience? And if your audience is the executive director of the World Food Program, she doesn't care about those statistical parameters. They're there for people who need them on this other page, but let's make sure the visualization actually helps people make a decision about what they're supposed to be doing, which is a little different than just like quarterly reporting, which sometimes quarterly reporting isn't necessarily to enable decision making. It's more of an accountability thing. And then that's where I think that the text and filter model might actually work pretty well.
I'm wondering with the whole idea of moving people along slowly from the traditional, did you put any of your design choices driven by the export functionality into a PDF?
Great question.
That's a really good question. So when we ended up building our first version of our living annual report, Neal mentioned it was kind of skinned differently. It was in portrait format as opposed to landscape, and it ended up having more text on it. That was largely driven because we thought that our users would want to export to PDF. And on the cover page, kind of on the front page, where, here, I'll drag down to it. On that original version of the front page, the one where Neal forced me to put a really big photo of him, on this,
It's not that big. Thank you.
on
It
this
could be
page,
bigger.
what I had
I like
done,
both of you.
I had this arrow that just pointed down here to the area on kind of the bottom border where on Tableau Public the export functionality was. And I included some text there like, hey, you can export to PDF. This is really cool. You can do it wherever you want to. And what we found out is no one was doing that. No one cared. And so a lot of the design decisions that we made here were motivated by the fact that we thought people wanted to take this as a printed annual report, that they might want to print it and export it. But honestly, we misjudged our users. They were much more kind of interested and savvy in interacting online than they were in printing it out. So, but we did try it, but we found that our users really were more interested in the interactive capabilities than anything else.
And I did print it, and it printed beautifully. So when you use this model that Jason used of your header and footer template, and then fill in the middle with the bits and pieces, then it actually printed. I printed it a couple times just to see. It actually printed really well. And then we have to print in some places in Africa because they don't have reliable high-speed broadband. So we actually have a project in Zambia where we have created a set of visualizations that are specific for printing, and then we print those out, and then we have a script that runs and then pushes those out to people in email every night or once a week or whatever the cadence is.
How did you find out that no one was using it? Like survey
We talked with people. So we ended up having kind of this initial kind of a rough draft out there for about 4 or 5 months. And throughout that time, we got the feedback that we ended up getting was, this is really cool, but. And our original design decision had been, we need to make sure that we are creating something that looks close enough to an annual report that doesn't scare people off, but shows them additional functionality. And that was kind of our number one motivator when it came to how we were thinking about framing our annual report. All of the feedback that we got was, push it further, just push it further, I want more. We're obviously not getting the level of detail from people who aren't writing to us and giving feedback, but from, literally every piece of feedback was, push it further, push through the interactive capability further, I want more.
And we were really clear about who our stakeholders were. So obviously our employees and our management team were stakeholders. But then we actually reached out to very specific people who were kind of data and open data advocates in the nonprofit sector. So Lucy Bernholtz at Stanford and Michael Lesner at Powered by Data. And we sent it to them basically saying, give us feedback on transparency, give us feedback on functionality. Does this really tell our story well? And we got awesome feedback from them. And both of them really are into promoting transparency and all of that. And that was a really important set of stakeholders to engage. We also sent it to some foundations. And some of the foundations that saw this, one, in fact, abandoned their printed annual report process and are starting to move to this. And they were so excited because they said they spent like 50 to 100K a year printing their annual reports. And we did a heavy lift in the beginning, a couple months' work, and now we essentially print an annual report every week by updating the visualization, and it costs us 10 minutes of time.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
So other than your annual filters, can you go back to point in time? So, to the gentleman said, we've got quarterly or annual, monthly, point in time. You're updating it weekly, so I've got today's weekly update, but I wanted to go back and compare that to yesterday, where I haven't crossed the fiscal year. How can you manage that?
We've chosen not to have that functionality in here, but if we wanted to, one of the things that we could do is in here, we could change this filter from a year filter to a date range filter, and that would achieve that functionality. But one of the ways that we may, it could be overkill. One of the ways that we may end up adding that functionality, I really want to expose this underlying data source with some suppressions in place. And so when we end up migrating over to Tableau Server, there's this guest authentication type of thing where people don't have to have a login or anything like that. You can use web authoring with that. And so my conception here is that we can provide people a link to web author that's already connected to this data source, and they can just go answer their own questions. And that would be a big push in the transparency side of things, and it will require us to end up doing that change management process and make sure that people are comfortable with that. But I'm really excited about being able to do that.
And actually, what's funny is part of our iterative process is we didn't have this annual view. So our first rev didn't have this, and somebody wrote back or gave us feedback that said, it's in our report, I should be able to see what you did in 2014. We're like,
my face got really red.
That's probably a good thing. So I think for his question and your comment, that's where sitting with the stakeholder and walking through it with them, if they come up and they say, this is super important to me, then it should be added, of course.
I'm sorry, I want to follow up on this as well. So with your data mapping, your data set is small enough that you're just copy and pasting it in. Is there a tipping point where you say, at this stage, that's really not the best way we need to actually build the integration?
The tipping point was a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when I was going through that kind of 6-hour process to make basic charts and graphs. So I run an Alteryx workflow, and that ends up taking these messy, awful, terrible files, and ends up just creating. I have them to third normal form, and it's dumping to. Excel files, but they are, I'm essentially building a database with tables and primary key to integrate all of them.
And we pull data from Salesforce, Excel spreadsheets, text files. We pull all that together, and then the Alteryx workflow helps get it into an organized format. Yeah. Did you have a question?
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So I'm looking at something like this in real time to report, and we have several divisions and sectors, and I want to create some competition amongst them to see who can reach certain targets within our charitable giving promises. Do you have any sort of dashboard or any sort of idea on how we can make that very competitive, if you will?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you 2 examples, and the good news is I think both of them are here. So in the expo hall where we have 4 of our grantees, Feeding America actually, so they're a network of 200 food banks who are all independent 501c3s. They had their network actually agree on a set of 12 performance measures, and then they created a dashboard, and they'll be able to show it to you. And if I'm the Roadrunner Food Bank in New Mexico, I can see their bar charts. I can see sort of myself in blue and everybody else, and then kind of where the average is. And I can see where I'm below the line and above the line. And what that does is 2 things. One, it sort of helps with the competition thing, because I can see myself relative to my peers. But it's also driving collaboration a bit in the network. So Roadrunner sees it's below the line on one parameter, and another food bank is above the line. And so what they're doing is starting to call each other and ask each other, what are you doing to get above the line, and sort of informally sharing information. The other example is Path, who are also here. They have a dashboard showing data quality. And they have these 4 ways to measure data quality. And they list all of the community health centers in the southern province of Zambia and where they are in that data quality measure. Some are at 100%, some are at 60%, and within literally a week or two of actually showing that dashboard to the health centers, you could see the data quality line improve. It was really remarkable. So you can look at both of those. Those are really great examples.
All right, last question. Yes.
How did you decide what data indicators to be?
I mean, just discussion internally, really. We're a corporate foundation. Because of that, we don't have specific reporting requirements. And so ultimately, these are the things that we cared about in terms of measuring our success. So we developed this basically by consulting with our executive team, but also largely driven out of the foundation team and the metrics that we cared about. So
one thing that interesting is the version 1 of this report was program focused.
Yes.
So it had these pages, and it was, here's our community grant program, here's our mission grant program. And what we realized in talking to people is that's our sort of navel-gazing view of our work. And what we decided to do is completely change the perspective so that the story that people outside Tableau were reading was the story about our work and the impact we're having. And again, that was really, we got there through an iterative process. These 4 measures here, I think we had a couple of different ones in there that we got to a point where like, that's really more just internal self-congratulating and not really, something that we need to talk about. So we've iterated continually, and you'll probably see over time we'll add new things here as we actually learn more about how to tell our story in the world.
So thank you all for coming to the session today. One thing that I want to ask you is if you have a chance, rate this session and...
Subliminal. Thank you all.
And we will be downstairs at the Tableau Foundation booth. We're in the expo hall right next to the store. If you want to come by, ask additional questions, we'll be around most of the day there. So thanks.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.